Hello, everybody out there in YouTube land. This is Howler Mouse. I'm going to recommend some books that came out in the 90s. I've set up certain parameters, right? Like, there's tons of great stuff you can pick up and read, but if it started in the 80s, or if the majority of the series carried on into the 2000s, I've left it out. So Neil Gaiman's Sandman and Sandman related books such as the Death miniseries, one shots, and books of magic and things like that. Even though there's some stuff that came out in the 90s, it's not in there because it started in the 80s. I didn't put in the JSA series that James Robinson and David Goyer started because that started in 99 and a majority of that is in the 2000s. So, with that disclaimer said, let's talk about the 90s. Now, I have always said that I have grew up in a very lucky time, right? I got to see the rise and fall of the arcades. Had pool tables and pinball machines. I had Pong, Atari, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Sega, PlayStation. I was around for all of it. I actually still have some of the stuff. And then the comic books I had. I had the stepdad and uncle's collection with the magazines and the Conan. Television as a young child, we had Wonder Woman, Hulk, Super Friends. You couldn't shake a stick without finding something superhero like. And of course, we had the Christopher Reeve Superman movie. I have very faint memories of the world Star Wars influenced. I've always sort of compared things to where it said that there's actually a pop culture event where you had pre Star Wars and after Star Wars. And then, of course, I kind of grew up in the 80s. And then I was 17 years old in 1990. And a lot of people they have a lot of different experiences as we have in life, not to paint a broad brushstroke. But the truth of the matter is that there was a huge cultural shift from like 91 up until about 93. For my experience, and a lot of my friends around ourselves, 17, 18, 19, 20, very confusing times for people because of the cultural shift. Um, and we're just talking about, we'll just take music for example, man, coming out of the hair band era, picking up on alternative music as it was called, and then Nirvana hitting. Nirvana upstaged, outsold Michael Jackson. A lot of reasons that happened is people were actually trying to take their music of their Michael Jackson CDs, if you will, and we're getting their money back to buy Nirvana. I went in, a bunch of us in about 1992 went and watched Guns N' Roses in concert, and we walked in our basic black that was traditional to concerts. We walked in, it was all flannel. Things we were wearing like in 83 and 84 just because of where we lived. And everybody was waving, swaying back and forth with their hands the pre show when they were pumping in music to Pearl Jam's Black. I, luckily enough, had picked up Pearl Jam 10. I had seen Nirvana a few months, the summer before they broke, the way I remember it. I was walking across the living room, MTV was on, and they caught my attention because Smells Like Teen Spirit was playing. And I went, that's pretty smart. They yell and then they whisper, then they scream and then they whisper. I was like, there might be something. Who knew? Come to find out, there's a chance that I actually saw Nirvana before they were huge, and I didn't even realize that was the band because we left. It sounded like noise. That's a whole other story. But then we get into the comics, right? As much as I love the 90s and growing up, it didn't really feel like the 90s had its own identity, if you will, until about 1993. A lot of things happened in 1993 with the music and TV shows and movies and fashion and everything like that. And what I like about comic books and graphic novels and stuff is that they can be a time capsule. They can reflect everything from the ads to possibly the comics and stuff that was going on. But after having MTV in the 80s actually being a party is what it felt like. The 90s ended up sort of being, I've heard it described as like the 90s was the little brother of the 80s. 80s was the big brother, and they tried to be their brother. And in truth, for what the 90s started out, about 95 and 96, things started fizzing out. We went from Nirvana to where we ended with the boy bands. If and however you feel about that is up to you, but you can actually see it. MTV stopped playing videos 24 hours, and we had reality shows that were garbage. We watched the news turn into something that, in my opinion, was actual news. And then, thanks to OJ and everybody knows where they were when OJ was doing the chase on the television screen. I was at a Hardee's at 10 o'clock at night because of the time difference. We started seeing tabloids be more mainstream. Things we read in the tabloids or heard about them ended up being more mainstream. We had garbage talk shows all the time, right? And things like that, but it was still pre-internet, and we got to see the internet and emails really start coming in around 96 and 97. Um, so what was going on at comics at the time, right? Well, I was in a community college my first year, and I had so many people commenting me. I still had the mullet at the beginning of the 80s there, and it was definitely gone by 93, don't get me wrong. And I also ended up hitchhiking for 9 months. That's a whole story up and down the East Coast. Started on the Appalachia Trail, was like, that's not for me. Ended up getting on the trucker circuit for a couple months there. So I got to see like real things change in real life, if that makes any sense, right? I watched how that we were at the brisk of the hippie. What was left over of the hippie movement was moving on into being something else, and we were having serial killers being popularized and put on trading cards. And in comics, we had Image Comics debut, if you will. Their big announcement actually was at a press conference, and it was on CNN. At the community college, people had went out to the smoking area, found me, brought me into the recreation area, and on this big screen TV, I look up there, and there's Todd McFarlane, Jim Valentino, Eric Larson, Mark Silvestri, Jim Lee, all of them just lined up there with cameras flashing on them, and they're talking about Image Comics is coming. They're forming. They're leaving Marvel. All this stuff. It was amazing, right? And then all of a sudden, everybody in the comics business was wanting to, well, make their own books, and and other companies were popping up like Malibu, who were, everybody was making their own universe. Everybody was making a whole new lines of comics and stuff, right? Everybody wanted that piece of pie for them. And because of this, we ended up having at one point in the 90s, if a comic book shop had ordered every comic book that was being released, you would have around 800 books on the shelf every month there for a while. And of course, it imploded eventually. So, gimmick covers, all that clout, all those people trying to get that piece of the pie and everything, they decided that, things were happening to get the customers. Let's get creative. Let's get the customers' attention. Variant covers, glossy covers, just Continuity Comics came up with the unrippable cover. Malibu Comics came out with the bullet hole through a comic book, all the way through a comic book, and it was just a glut of horrible stuff. And a lot of the quality of the mainstream books went down, came up, went down. And a few things happened, right? People have given the 90s late books. Image was huge on the late books. That was a big thing also. So all this stuff was having a little bit of a backlash and stuff, right? People were making money, and lots of money, creators were. And then there was people coming into it because of stunts like the variant covers, the embossed covers, the silver covers, whatever you want. And the death and stunts like the death of Superman, Batman getting his back broken, replacing heroes like Hal Jordan with Kyle Rayner. All sorts of things were happening. And they were basically stunts, and a lot of people could see through it, and sometimes they worked out just fine. I sort of had a good time through the whole thing. I had a good time through the whole thing, despite the fact that a lot of the comics with the mainstream, Marvel pointing out, really kind of went downhill. And they tried a few things, right? So what I'm going to show you, I could go on and on talking about the 90s, how the suits came in at Marvel and they ended up taking their one universe and sectioning it off and all sorts of things, marking it out the Marvel Universe to a section of the Marvel Universe to the said Image Comics, two of those guys, and all sorts of things were happening, right? And I could just talk and talk and talk because I was there. I got to see it. And had access to a lot of comic book companies and started finally going to cons because of my age and everything that was going on. Also went through basic training, so yeah, joined the military there for a bit. Had a little bit more scratch to get a few more books, and I worked in a comic book shop at the time. A lot of things happened in the 90s, right? So 1990, I'm a junior. I think this may have come out in the summer. Maybe I'm between a junior going into being a senior, somewhere around there, right? A lot of stuff happened that summer. And we started out the 90s with something I recommend, and you'll know what this is because if you've watched any of the Marvel movies, you know that there was a total of around 33 movies that this is what they were going for, right? But we started out with Infinity Gauntlet, 1990, right? And what had happened is throughout the 80s, you're going to see that there's a lot of things. You have to know a little bit about the 80s to see where the 90s are coming from. But you get this mini series, right? Jim Starlin, who had been fired, he took the hit for Robin being voted out, Jason Todd to die. The marketing people were like, what the hell did you do? We still have to market Robin. And Jim Starlin was let go. He returns back to Marvel. And the first thing he does, he gets to bring back touch on Thanos. He pops in there and takes over Silver Surfer, and he starts bringing mining back the past all the way to the 70s and stuff that he was doing with Thanos and returning Adam Warlock and his bunch and the crew. And we get the Infinity Gauntlet coming up. 3 issues by George Perez, who was a workhorse at the time, but sadly enough, due to him overextending himself, is what I've heard. He did the first 3 issues of this instead of all 6. He was doing War of the Gods and having problems with DC because Wonder Woman, it was her anniversary, and he wanted them to get behind her and have a big crossover with War of the Gods, and DC just didn't get behind it, so it flopped. So luckily we got George Perez to float around and have some fun at other places and stuff, right? So Infinity Gauntlet started you out in the 90s, in my opinion, right? That was sort of like a bookend for what the 80s was because crossovers, starting with Secret Wars 2, Crisis on Infinite Earth, a little bit of Secret Wars right before that and stuff, more like Massacre. This was all new, but it ended up becoming an annual event that carried over. And it still goes on, right? So that's recommended reading right there, right? Um, 80s was a lot of the 80s was a lot about the grim and gritty and the deconstruction of comics, and a lot of people had something to say about it. And one of those people is Mark Waid. So we're going to kind of show you a few things there that before we get, I got to keep this moving, keep this going. But a lot of what happened was due to this grim and gritty and the glut of books out there and changing things over. And still talking about Watchmen, the rise of Watchmen, ironically, a couple years after it had come out, it was gaining more and more fans over the years and staying in publication. And basically, what was happening is that a lot of people were ready for something different. They just didn't know what it was. In walks Mark Waid, and he takes over the Flash book. Mark Waid had already been around in comics for a while, editing and doing some stories here and there. And he comes out with number 62 of the Flash, year one here, chapter one, Thunderstruck, Born to Run, is what it's called, basically. And he ends up making this book super hot. And then eventually we have an artist come on here, Mike Wieringo, and then all of a sudden we have the return of Barry Allen, the story that everybody wanted. And this is, of course, the Wally West Flash. And he humanized him. All of a sudden, we're with Wally. We're in this world. And basically, the hero, the Flash, Barry Allen Flash, who had started the Silver Age, basically, with his book, arguably, all of a sudden we're returning to his Silver Age roots with the legacy part of this, of Wally West and Mark Waid just working magic on this. And this book was being loved because it was so different than all the grim and gritty out there, all the big gun toting X-Men wannabe books out there, all the Wolverine wannabes. Every team has a beast on it. This is going to rip you apart and everything like that. And also get something that's a lighter tone, but it still has stakes and it's humanistic, And Wally West is a good guy. So yeah, the Mark Waid run of Flash, highly recommended. Of course, yes, that is signed by that, right? And of course, with the theme of legacy going through there, we ended up getting more characters, the Speed Force, how characters are connected and stuff. And we ended up getting a new character named Impulse, who you might have heard of and stuff. And yes, this is my signed copy as well by Mark Waid, right? So yeah, a lot of going forward and moving forward with that. Oh my goodness, number one signed by Mark Waid, right? But anyway, we were getting things like that were going on, right? So with that reactionary, what I'm talking about, showing you where we're still having things from the 80s coming to books and still influencing them and playing around with them. We had certain books that came out and they were actually commentary, you know, commentary a little bit about where comics were at the time with the glut of comics and the things that I've mentioned over and over what they were talking about. But in that, we ended up having Alex Ross, who was a huge part of the 90s, come out with Kingdom Come. Now, if you get the 4 issues of Kingdom Come, that's great. If you get the trade, you get several pages that did not fit in the book. There's extra pages, which is why I'm showing this. And basically, we get a future of Kingdom Come. Kingdom Come is the future of the DC universe, and it's also commentary on the violence, the how heroes aren't acting like heroes, how anti-heroes are way too popular, and of course, Alex Ross threw in some biblical revelations in their threads, tying it to our heroes, and we're going towards Armageddon in this, the return of Superman, in a world where the second generation, this new generation of heroes don't act like heroes, and they really weren't too far off the mark with this, right? It's very subtle. So this is like a masterpiece, in my opinion. And of course, this was like 1996, and it holds up today. Kingdom Come, check it out. Trying to move along. I'm trying not to drag us down, right? So we now had Mark Waid looking at the past a little bit and legacy, and then we had Alex Ross looking at the future. But when Alex Ross really hit the scene, he'd already been around. He'd already been around. Terminator, now comics and things, and he'd already been around. But he became a superstar when we had Marvels come out. Oh my God, what year was this? 93. This should be 93, 94. Excuse me, 1994. And basically, what Kurt Busiek did is that he threw a pitch about sort of retelling the history of the actual Marvel Universe, the king of continuity, through the eyes of Phil Sheldon, a photographer, if you will, right? So Kurt Busiek got to read a bunch to do his research. He got to read a bunch of Marvel comics even going back before they were Marvel into the Golden Age, and he's able to fit things back together. And he started seeing how Stan Lee, who I give a hard time, and a lot of people get a hard time, and more people are realizing he didn't actually write a lot of what he wrote or claimed to have wrote, but he did steer the ship, and he kind of came in with a continuity with Marvel Comics in the '60s. And Kurt Busiek was fascinated when he was trying to figure out when did the Sentinels invade New York, and then after he read the comics and looked at when these comics came out and the cover dates and things like that, he realized the Sentinels had to have invaded New York in the 60s, the same night that Reed and Sue got married. And this goes into the 70s, 40s to the 70s, and things like that, right? And this was just fantastic, full of Easter eggs. Alex Ross poured his heart into this. He has little Easter eggs of the Watchmen in here during things like that, focusing on Gwen Stacy. Again, a very light, humanistic approach with dark tones that should be there and things like that when it is needed, because it is the world outside our window, is what Marvel used to be. So that point of view, that reader point of view of Phil Sheldon that carried over, Alex Ross carried over with a character in Kingdom Come I showed you and stuff, ended up being a very cool storytelling technique, if you will, that people were interested in. Basically, it's first person of one character, which is fantastic, right? So this led into a series. It started out as a mini series, an ongoing series, a series of mini series, then an ongoing series again, and now it's going to be one shots and stuff. But in 1995, a year after that, we started getting Astro City, character designs and covers by Alex Ross. Brent Anderson, a veteran of storytelling, is in there doing these. And basically, we got archetypes and original characters and different takes on stories. The more you've read comics, the more you can enjoy this because of the point of view and the little twist. And if you don't like one story arc, just wait, there's another coming, right? So Astro City is just this entire world where we have characters here, characters there. You pick up history. You can really put yourself in there. Luckily, I have every issue of Astro City out there. And also on my wall, I have the original promotional poster that came out in 1995. That is one of the first things usually you could go in, ask, can I have, the comic book, this lets you know comic book shops aren't allowed to sell promotional material, just to get that out there. So from what I understand, all the comic shops I knew about, and when I worked at one, we weren't allowed to, even though that was over 30 years ago. But anyway, this was one of the few things where I walked in and you could say, "Can I have that?" They were like, "When we put your name on the back of it, when we take it down, if your name's the first one, you get to have it." No, I let them know I was taking that one. That was probably the only thing I took out of a comic book shop that I'm like, it's mine. If you have Instagram, you can scroll down and probably see it on my wall. So Astro City, right? Just that's recommended, highly recommended reading, right? So we talked about, like, I kind of touched on Image Comics a little bit. Image Comics was the artist coming out and doing what they wanted, and the writing was weak. A lot of the books were late, and Todd McFarlane had the stroke of genius. I, I don't give Todd McFarlane a hard time on his writing, because when he got his own Spider-Man book, if you go look at the letters column and the editorial that he did, he was asking for people to give him suggestions on how to improve his writing. He tried. He was asking for critiques. He put himself out there. So I don't give him a hard time. But between the books being late and the writing being so on them, quickly people were getting underwhelmed a little bit with Image, even though they still had this. They were putting out comics like Pop Records, and I knew people who were buying every one of them, even though 2 or 3 years later they were using those to put out in their greenhouse to protect their plants from frost. Um, Todd McFarlane came in and he paid some of the top writers to come in and write some Spawn books. Okay, so the writing was still there, and this fantastic company under Jim Shooter came out, and we had Unity, right? So when everybody is out there like, I got to have my Image books, all of Unity, excuse me, we had Valiant Comics come out, and in the Jim Shooter era, they got the licensed products, Magnus, the Robot Hunter. Dr. Solar. Eventually, we've got Turok in there, and they came up with the original characters like Exo Man of War, Shadow Man. Um, I highly recommend you reading Alpha and Omega to see what we're doing there with Solar, Barry Windsor Smith. Yeah, I have them all right here. I'm always picking these up. We had Shadow Man, Rye, Ray, Exo Man of War. Apparently, I have some doubles. And Harbinger. Harbinger was on fire. That is still, Harbinger #1 is still a coveted book. But anyway, we came in and Jim Shooter had really wanted to make a universe of heroes and villains and all that stuff where it's actually set in the real world. Everyone actually does age in real time. And it was just fantastic. These books were on fire. He kept it a low print run. He did gimmicks that actually paid off, to where if you got rewards more than they felt like gimmicks. You buy the first couple of issues, it has a coupon. You cut out the coupon, mail it in, you get an exclusive zero issue. So people were buying two of each, so they could have a coupon in their book with some of them, right? And it led up to this. These are signed by Barry Windsor Smith, but it led up to Unity, and these two books were free. It was up to the comic shop to give you the bookends for the big crossover they had built it up to. And of course, Acclaim came in and ended up buying out the place. And then there was a, how can I say this? I don't want to like using the word hostile takeover, but Jim Shooter and I will not name the people involved, because they are comic book people and they have fans, sort of went with Acclaim, and Shooter got pushed out, ended up going to Defiant Comics, and that was the whole thing, right? So my recommendation is the well-written books, and they even had a crossover that was fun called Deathmate with Image, right? But you had Image and Image and Valiant being the books that were the most talked about there for quite a bit. So I highly recommend those. Highly recommend those. Let me get a drink. I'm having a good time here. And of course, I have videos probably on all of this stuff. I think I have like an hour-long live show when we had the pandemic going on, where I'm just like an amazingly nostalgic look at the Valiant universe or something, right? So yeah, check out my other stuff, right? So we're talking about a bunch of indie stuff, right? And I sort of mentioned with my experience, 1993 was the year. Make sure I got the right year here on this book. Yeah. 1993 for me was when the 90s was actually the 90s, right? X-Files came out, for example. Okay. X-Files was out. I found Mystery Science Theater was an all-time high. So David Letterman was on CBS. Conan was coming up on the late night show. David Letterman actually snuck on the set. There was television shows and things going on. Documentaries of serial killers were coming up. Sci-Fi Channel and some other comedy network and the Ha Network were merging, I think, in that year. But there was a lot of things, right? And I was 20 years old, and I just quit the hitchhiking. And in 1994, I'd be going to the military and stuff, right? So 93 was a good time, and the music was just fantastic, right? Just that's why I can remember it the most. The music was just fantastic, right? So in the midst of that, this book came out, and after all the glut as I was telling you about and hearing of things, we had this book where you start hearing about it called Hellboy by Mike Mignola. And Mike Mignola already been around. I knew who Mike Mignola was. He already sort of had his fans. He was bouncing around. He's starting to become known as Monsters after working at DC and Marvel and First Comics and popping up on a lot of covers. This is basically what he was doing. And all of a sudden, we started hearing about Hellboy. Now, Hellboy's really desensitized, but when you hear that, but when that came out, that sounded fucking evil. Okay, I mean, you were like, I don't know if I want to get that book and stuff. You thought you were gonna be in trouble, right? So anyway, Seeds of Doom, Hellboy. He debuted in New Mutants. I don't think I need to talk about Hellboy. We should all know who Hellboy is, but that blue collar take of this and having moments of levity in there when we have these H.P. Lovecraft themes going through there with a blue collar comedy every now and then to lighten the mood. Fantastic. People absolutely fell in love with Hellboy. So I recommend Hellboy. And then the indie book of the 90s, the one that I think really popped to kind of start us out, I think Bone started in 91. Yeah, 1991, ended in 2004. But was Jeff Smith's cartoon book Bone out of nowhere. I remember people going, when they heard number one was super hot and we were getting all sorts of reprints and stuff, everybody was like, what the hell is Bone? What the hell is Bone? Uh, Bone by Jeff Smith. Started out highly influenced by Carl Barks, a little bit of Lord of the Rings, and as the story goes on, it does get darker, Lord of the Rings wise. And it was everywhere. We had Ace editions from Wizard. I have a ton of this stuff signed by Jeff Smith and stuff. Ash cans. Um, just fantastic stuff, right? Reprinted over and over. You get it the complete Bone in one volume. You have scholastic editions where they colored it. It was black and white. Fantastic book. Check it out. The other book I highly recommend because, like I told you, 93 was the year. I think by 95 or 96, this ended up becoming a cartoon on MTV when things were just very cool. You had like Liquid Television, you had the Head, and then you had the Max. But the Max came out, and this was reactionary a little bit due to Sam Keith leaving the Sandman book a few years before this with Neil Gaiman. Because Neil Gaiman gave us a Mary Poppins who is death, and Neil Gaiman gave us a Mary Poppins death, if you will. You know the character. I'm reining it in here. And Sam Keith was sort of like, no, death is cold and miserable and nothing nice and stuff, right? So that kind of influenced the Max a little bit, right? And what was the mystery of the Max? The surrealism in this, the Outback, Julie, and some dark tones in there, right? This, and the next book I'm going to show you are, to me, time capsules of the 90s if you want to see the early 90s, the pure 90s. The next one would be Strangers in Paradise. Now, I came on Strangers in Paradise quite late, and you would hear about this book. Yeah, this is signed also. You would hear about this book, right? But you need to check this out. Strangers in Paradise, Catch You. I feel like anything I kind of say about it is going to kind of ruin it. But each issue is sort of written like a television episode. And I heard Terry Moore speak about a year or two ago at a convention in Abingdon, Virginia, RobCon, where he was like, I know you're not supposed to do that, but there's quite a bit. Catch You is in love. We'll just leave it at that, man. But it's like love triangles, and you go to this, it's like you're visiting the 90s very well, right? And there you can, and I have a lot of individual issues, and there's a lot of trades on there. Katchu is a beautiful young woman living a quiet life with everything going for her. She's independent, smart, very lovable with her best friend Francine, who she's in love with. Lovable neurotic with a heart of gold. Everything is perfect until Kachu's former employer, the deadly Miss Parker, comes looking for her at $850,000 in missing mob money. Her idyllic life begins to fall apart. Kachu realizes she never left the past behind. She brought it with her and now it threatens to destroy her and the woman she loves. So that's what I mean. There's all sorts of little plots like that, little slice of life and stuff like that, right? I kind of think if you like Hate by Peter Begg, you'll probably like this, okay? And then we go back to where again I want to mention the reactionary stuff of the 80s, and this is a man who like helped form comics in the 80s with what he brought in. He kind of didn't change anything, but he brought in that noir, that grim and gritty, that oh the darkness and the shadows and stuff, if you will. And then he goes to Hollywood and works on the screenplays for two movies and doesn't is not happy with what's going on, so his reaction is to return to comics at through Dark Horse and decides to make a comic that is impossible for Hollywood to film. And through Dark Horse Presents, we ended up getting Frank Miller's Sin City. This is an early collection of that first story. Before it was called The Hard Goodbye, it was just Sin City. Now, what's ironic about what I'm showing you here is that this kind of helped start the 90s, and a lot of this stuff ended in the year 2000 that I'm showing you. Like, it is exactly where it needs to be. Um, and then we're going to move on over here, and I'm going to go ahead and show you my favorite story, right? Probably my favorite book. But it didn't just start out that way, right? I mentioned in 94 I went to the military. And when I came out of basic training, I had to back up, and I discovered I don't know. This came in '93. I just remember when I bought it. Let me see what year it actually came out. Okay, '93 to '94, right? So I kind of missed it. But anyway, the Golden Age, a four-issue miniseries by this guy James Robinson. I think he wrote some Grendel and a few things before. This comes out of the blue. And we get a retelling of not a retelling, but we get to see what happened to those heroes of the 1940s. Where they went, what happened to them, and you have things like divorce. This thing is very grounded. There's great Starmen segments. Of course, it started out as an Elseworld. So, in my opinion, you sort of have like the New Frontier by Darwin Cook that came out a decade later. You have that as the Silver Age. Well, I mean, you have this, then the Silver Age, and then Kingdom Come if you want. There's like you can put some of these books together, right? But the Golden Age, right? This is fantastic. You know, Golden Age. They're all Elseworld stories. They don't really tie together, but they will, right? So this was an Elseworld stories. There's some Starman stuff in it, Manhunter stuff in here, Dan the Dynamite, relics of World War II. Where are they at? Johnny, was it Johnny Quick or the Tarantula? The Tarantula has written a book about what was going on. He's married to Liberty Bell, and there's all sorts of things going on in there. It's just fantastic, right? So I have the original issues and the hardcover and softback. But this ended up leading to having ties, some of the Starman stuff in there that's just in there for a few panels here and there, ends up leading to Starman by James Robinson. And to me, this is the book. This is the book that I was buying out of a grocery store. I think the first 5 or 6 issues. I think by the sixth issue, I was a little bored with it. And it disappeared from the stands. And eventually, somewhere down the line, a guy I worked with was like, Tim, you need to get back into, you need to get Starman. I told him I'd read it before, la la la. He was like, no, no. He said, it is you. You need to read it. So when you take the movie High Fidelity with John Cusack and you take Starman, this book, apparently this is me in the 90s. My friends, I even had the long, you can watch Verb Pipe, Bittersweet Symphony, and I had the leather jacket, and that's how I pictured this. I had, had a little goatee and stuff, right? So yeah, this was fantastic. Starman to me may be the book, the best book of the 90s. Ran 80, 81 issues, a couple specials, a couple annuals here and there. But then, if you really want something that can only exist in the 90s with the conspiracy and the craziness, and Grant Morrison saying that he's taking drugs while as he wrote it and came up with the aliens who could add 13 letters to our alphabet, but if we knew those 13 letters and tried to read or say them, it made us sick. And it was a secret conspiracy going on, and the universe will. You have to look around because the universe will give you, psychedelic spells to use and energy and everything like that's going on. You have the Invisibles. through Vertigo because yes, thanks to things that happened in the '80s with Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman and probably somebody I'm not even thinking about, we ended up getting Karen Berger getting a whole to edit her whole other line of comics called Vertigo. And Vertigo had its own fans. Okay, so yeah, but this was Invisibles. Invisibles is something you should be reading. But don't worry. I mean, just because Grant Morrison was out there serving himself with that story, the beginning and end, and you had to read it several times if you could understand everything. We had a return. In the 80s, we had the Justice League, and then by, oh my God, what was it, 83 or 84, I have an old 10-year-old video, I bet, about how much I hate Justice League Detroit. Then we had Crisis, and then we had Legends, and out of Legends came Keith Giffen, James DeMante's Justice League. And out of that, we ended up having quite a few years, a good 5 years of Wahaha. And then the Justice League sort of stammered around, and people reached a point where they wanted their Justice League to come back. So we got Grant Morrison, Howard Porter coming out with JLA, and Grant Morrison had based all of these heroes on the gods of Olympus. He assigned everybody they all got a role. Somebody was Zeus and somebody was Phoebus and all that stuff, right? And that led into some great stories with American Dream. I think he did the first, the entire thing was probably about 41 issues with a couple breaks of Mark Waid coming in there, and it was just fantastic, right? So those are two mainstream books I highly recommend, the Starman stuff and Grant Morrison. If you want something a little offbeat, we had Doom 2099. This is signed by Pat Broderick. And it started out like, is this really Doctor Doom of the 20th century popping up in 2099? About 2 years into the series, Warren Ellis came on, and even though you don't hear a lot of people talking about those issues, they are very hard to get. Warren Ellis's Doom 2099 stuff is the stuff to get. And then we had something happen in the early 90s. After 17 years, Chris Claremont left the X-Men. Did Jim Lee help push him out? Did Marvel help push him out? Those are topics for other times, right? But the fact of the matter is Claremont was gone. 17 years of building up the X-Men, building up subplots that some went somewhere, some never did, and some never will now. We had a new crew come in. And within 3 years, they had gutted and pillaged everything that Chris Claremont did in 17 years, and they were struggling. They didn't know where to go. They can't fool me. So all of a sudden, they kind of looked back. We had Days of Future Past, which was like this iconic, and it still is, iconic X-Men storyline. And they finally brought in a lot of some Roger Cruz and some other artists and stuff had come in. And this was a new generation coming. These guys would end up leaving and going to Image also. But they brought in these guys who were influenced by anime and video games with their art style, and suddenly there's this fresh take. It is not Claremont's X-Men anymore because we got X-Men Age of Apocalypse finally came in, where what would happen to the X-Men if they did not have Xavier? All right, so Xavier has been, it's an alternate timeline, if you will, where Xavier was not, he was assassinated. He was killed. And all of a sudden, we had this whole world of what would happen without him in his Age of Apocalypse, right? And Mark Waid was brought in to write some of this. All the X-Men books, about for 4 months, all the X titles were taking place in this Age of Apocalypse world. And it was a big hit. It was just a fresh take, a new coat of paint, if you will. We even got two miniseries amongst all the other books. I have a complete set up there. What happened to the other people who weren't mutants? What happened to the X-Men and the Hulk and Daredevil and things like that without Xavier in this world? Okay, so it was a big hit, and they kind of revisit it every now and then, right? And then, I mean, how can you have any decade without a super hit of Batman, right? So Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale came on. They're doing these one shots. You had Nightfall, Night Quest, all these things going on with Batman. You had a new Batman coming out at the time that was, Azrael, who just it was just a rough time. The early '90s was just a rough time on a lot of people, on a lot of comics and stuff, right? But then all of a sudden, out of the midst of this, throughout the '90s, this one story came out, and it's still talked about, and it's still one of the favorite ones. It's still timeless. I like it because it's an actual mystery. It's an actual mystery, right? But we had Batman, The Long Halloween, by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. This is the Noir edition, right? A 13 issue miniseries, 14 because I think it had a 0 issue, and it had a sequel called Dark Victory. It's been adapted into a 2-part straight to DVD cartoon. It's been very influential. So you had that. And then there's something about the '90s that happened where, of course, this man would be here. There was one writer in particular who I think was people were seeing him as the second coming, if you will, right? Neil Gaiman's Sandman at Vertigo was coming down, the #1 book, and he was coming out of nowhere with books like The Punisher Kills the Marvel Universe, and then he has this ongoing series called The Preacher. And if they have tried to turn this into a television show that I heard really didn't follow the book that much and stuff, right? But Preacher, as much as I feel Starman is the book of the '90s, this is probably the book of the '90s, And considering that how heavy-handed Preacher was, how we have Jesse Custer down in Texas ends up getting the word, and he's on a quest to talk to God to see why he abandoned his throne, and a lot of messed up stuff. We have Irish vampires on it, and secret cults, and all sorts of dark things going on. He had a story that was a little bit lighter because Garth Ennis really doesn't like superheroes, right? So he came out with a book that lasted, I think, 60 issues. I have all of them also, and I'm finding some of the trades so I can just pull them down and read them. But he also had Hitman going on in '96 in the DC universe proper. Um, so basically, Tommy Monaghan has was bit by an alien during a Bloodlines crossover. He gained the power of X-ray vision and telepathy, but he hardly ever uses it because he's a hitman. Of course, he's ex-military. Served in Desert Storm with his buddy there, and he sort of has a code. He will take hits, but he will decide if he's going to do it. And he usually goes after bad guys. And his first hit in the series is he's paid to go after the Joker, which puts him up against the Batman. And if you think you're going to see some great big huge showdown between Tommy and the Batman, Batman, if I remember right, punches him in the gut and he throws up on Batman's boots in the middle of Arkham Asylum while I think the Joker is laughing. That's the second or third issue. It's been a while since I read them. So there you go, guys. Books I recommend for the '90s. Check them out. In the comments below, add some more stuff that you think is recommended reading in the comments. Like, share, subscribe. Read them comics and everybody be excellent to each other.